We travel on a train of thought, tracing a trajectory of tumultuous yesterdays. The past weaves itself into the present, morphing into a tapestry of tomorrows, seemingly different, remarkably the same. Each moment a seed with promise, 1,000 different directions, new and emancipating avenues to explore, yet mindlessly we muddle. Mesmerized by the mayhem, we manifest the same pain again and again.
That's the words of Steve Tsakiris, who is a poet, an author, a social impact advocate. And we had a chat to Steve on World Read Aloud Day. But he is such an inspirational force when it comes to developing poetry, and loved the latest offering called Wild Divinity, that we thought it would be amazing to just invite him back. Thank you for coming back, Steve. Really appreciate your energy and your time.
Thank you for having me back. It's great to be in the studio.
Just before we talk about Wild Divinity, what was the poem about?
So the poem is, actually kind of the idea that I have for today, if we can do it, is to take us on a little bit of a journey, to tell a story. And the story is that in life we have a lot of struggle. There's a lot of suffering happening. And that's where we begin. So this was about really the insanity that we create again and again and again through not being aware of the struggles that we face. And it's kind of like going into your garden full of weeds and saying, there are no weeds in my garden. There are no weeds in my garden.
It's denying reality.
Yes, there's no point to that. So we want to move forward, but we start with an acknowledgement, an awareness of what is, of the struggle. And that's what that poem was really about. And then from there, we want to move on to awareness and then transformation, so that we can become empowered. So that was the beginning, the ugliness of the story.
Yeah. And I think journeys are quite interesting because, and I wonder how you reflect on this before we even talk about the book, because I know you do work in so many other spaces.
Right.
And it almost, for me, makes perfect sense that if you consider the work that you do, and I want, in your own words, just to tell people the other work that you do, because I think once they get that, they'll understand how you think about words and the impact of words and why. And we'll unpack why it's called Wild Divinity.
Right.
But just, for the benefit of our listeners, the other scope of work that you do.
So I'm in the field of personal transformation, I like to call it. And it's kind of, to put it in a nutshell, I help people to remember who they are. Because I think we've forgotten.
Yeah.
We have forgotten. And I like to use the word remember as two words. To remember, to bring all the members of ourselves back into a unity.
Wow.
Because we're not only physical and we're not only mental, we're emotional, we're spiritual beings, and all of those aspects are very important to who and what we are. And I honestly believe we've forgotten who we are. So I help people to remember who they are.
Yeah. You started off by saying that you wanted to take us on that journey. And what is that journey?
So the journey is the journey of life. The reality is that there's a lot of suffering in life. There's a lot of struggle in life. There's a lot of ugliness in life. There just is. But we don't want to end there, because that poem was really about we kind of rehash stuff and we recreate it, because the past creates the present and the present creates the future. And if we are always working from a negative past in the present, we're going to create a negative future. So it's about breaking the cycle. And the little journey or the story that I wanted to tell was how we go from struggle to empowerment. And the in-between steps are awareness. We need to become aware of the weeds in our garden. And then the next step is the transformation starts to happen. And one of the poems that I will share is about that transformation. And only once we do that do we become empowered, because then we plant seeds in our mind and in our life that recreates a positive future rather than recreating a negative past into the future.
Yeah. So it's all of these ideas, the stuff that you work with, and then for people that don't know, apart from the stuff, the transformational stuff you do, you're also in the advocacy space. So you do a lot of social impact stuff too.
Yes.
So there's a lot on your plate. It's a full plate with a lot of things. How do you then find the quiet moments to develop this? Because poetry, I always find, whenever I've spoken to a poet, this isn't just stuff that comes to you. It's stuff that you've really thought about, that you've reflected on, stuff that is the past experiences. It could be triggered by a moment in nature that brings all of these things together. How do you find the quiet time to then be able to put words and And I think poets do something amazing for us that don't think about it. They really think about the meaning of words and how words should be put together to elicit a feeling, a response, a reaction. So I don't just think it's about placing down words, but it's almost the science of words and the chemistry of words.
That's such a beautiful and very deep question, hey. The reality of it is that we have this thing called the subconscious mind, and everything goes into our subconscious mind, every single experience that we have at every moment in time. And so whenever I'm doing whatever I'm doing, it's going into my subconscious mind. I do practice, that's what I teach as well, transformational stuff like meditation, like sound therapy work, like all of that kind of stuff. And so that also helps to create a space in your mind and heart so that the stuff that's in your subconscious mind can filter through. So poems, quite often, and that's why it's a great question that you ask, I don't sit and think about them. They just come. So I often say that I don't write poems, but poems write me. So they'll just come from somewhere. And nature is one of the most, my other book, Eternal, came out of nature. It came out of me spending so much time in nature that insights will just come. And I'll give you an interesting example about the subconscious thing, is that sometimes I'll write a poem and I'll use a word, and I kind of know what that word means, but I don't really know. And then I go and look that word up, and it's exactly the right word to describe that thing. So this stuff is coming from somewhere else. It's coming from somewhere deeper inside, beyond my conscious mind, from places. And poetry for me is a way of expressing and capturing an emotion and a moment. I write it to remind myself. When I have an insight, it comes. I write the poem so that I can remind myself. I never actually intended on publishing books or sharing the poetry. But then at some stage, a good friend of mine said to me, dude, you've got to share this stuff because people need to hear it.
Yeah. And so there's so much power in kind of words and naming things. And once you name something, you can't unname it. And so I think that there's such, and even when you name it, that name or word might not come from this current consciousness. It might be transcended through time, lineage, family, experiences, all of that. With that being said, with the kind of work that you do, I find the idea of naming a book of poems, thoughts, ideas, experiences, Wild Divinity. Because these two words, if you understand what the word wild means and what it means to be divine, are they not technically at odds with each other?
You ask such amazing questions, hey. Wild Divinity, the reason behind the name, and you're absolutely right, they don't oppose each other, but they are a paradox. And a paradox exists when both of these things are valid. So why did I call it Wild Divinity? Is because I think, first of all, we are animals. We are actually animals. We live in an animal body. We've got a reptilian brain, the old brain. We are animals, so we are wild. But we are also divine. And that's the kind of the unity. When I was a young child, I remember looking up at the stars, and nobody had ever told me this, but I felt like there was a unity, like the stars and myself, the sky, other people, we are one. We're not separate. And for me, that's the divinity part of it. So the two words wild and divinity is because we are encapsulated in this body, but we are divine creatures. We are God-like creatures. We have the ability to create new realities. We have the ability to create positive and negative stuff. But we live in a body that's an animal. So we're both wild and divine at the same time.
I looked at some of the titles, right? And you talked about you spend so much time in nature, and you actually, in actual fact, wrote a book that reflects that experience. But then you go through some of the titles, and some of the titles are butterfly. It's like for the soul. It's the one. And you kind of realize, like, there's one called Leaves. There's another one called Storm. And I look at the titles and I go, I think Steve is talking about our personalities, or when we fluctuate through moments, or we fluctuate through life. And at some point we do feel that we're by ourselves. At some point we do feel like we're going through a storm. And sometimes the nature of a butterfly is to move and to be carried. And I thought, how much of that is reflective of what we go through on a day-to-day basis?
It's exactly all in one. These are metaphors. So the poem Butterfly actually is one that I wanted to share, and maybe this would be a good time to share it. I don't know.
Share.
But so it's because they are metaphors. So it's all about the transformative nature of who we are as human beings. I'm just going to leaf through it and just find it while I just want to find the page. Butterfly is where are we? Okay, here we are, page 64. So let me read Butterfly. But before I read it, let me just say this, is that we often don't know that we are changing, because when we're going through the struggle, we don't know. So
I agree.
When this butterfly is a pupa, when it's in this cocoon, it's this ugly mush, it's going through hell. It doesn't know what's going to happen, but it needs to follow the steps in order to get to the other side. So let me just read the poem, Butterfly. There is a void at the center of our being that cannot be filled. A restlessness permeates. Like a cold wind, it blows, stripping us of our serenity. Our soul speaks in tongues unfamiliar to the mind, ancient tongues that only the heart can interpret. Our inner landscape trickles like a tributary of the great river, a subtle world of unconscious memories passed down through the ages, a convoluted clash of civilizations in each of us. Captured and confined to the servitude of sameness, we navigate the world with banal conformity. But always there is an ancient longing. Out of the darkness a radiant glow appears. Approaching, we see that this is the void. The same void we tried for so long to avoid. We meet ourselves, our reflection changing as we transform into a pupa, unrecognizable. We encounter the unknown, a place where mystery works its alchemy through us. This, the journey we began at the beginning of time. And through our struggles, we come to realize that the void we tried to fill was never meant to be filled. For in the emptiness, the pupa becomes a butterfly.
Yeah. I love it. And at the end of it, what is the butterfly? It's incredibly beautiful.
It is, and it's our transformation. It's that whole story of coming from struggle to being aware of it, to starting the transformation, being a pupa, and then becoming a butterfly, empowerment.
Are you saying, Steve, that all of us, that the commonality in our humanity is that we all struggle, we all go through change, we all will at the end of the experience be a butterfly, that we will all be able to learn from it, see the beauty in it, be able to use that for us that are conscious. We'll be able to learn from that and be able to be better for it.
Absolutely. We all have the same potential, hence the poem about oneness. We all have the same potential. The tragedy is that we don't all get to fulfill it, because if we are stuck, just like in that first poem, if we're recreating negative past in the present, we're going to recreate a negative future. So we need that second ingredient, which is awareness. And that's one of the crux. It's one of the most important things that I teach in my transformational work is self-awareness. It's actually a practice. It's about being aware of ourselves, physically, mentally, emotionally, the thoughts that go through our mind. If we are not, then we don't necessarily transform, and we don't become a butterfly. And isn't that one of the saddest things that we can do when we've got the potential not to fulfill it?
Yeah. And it is really amazing how your poetry and the poems, and I know this, I mean, this is the way poets operate. They look at the world as it is, and they think of a world that could be, and they develop the language in order for those that are into poetry. And I almost feel like we as a society, we used to love poetry, we used to be in love with it, and then something happened, and our children don't read poems the way they should, and maybe in its most basic form it's nursery rhymes and all that kind of stuff. But how do we get back to a space where we can appreciate poems, poetry, the art of writing poems? How do we get back to that space?
I've thought about that a lot, because funny enough, even though I've published 2 books of poetry, I don't call myself a poet. It's interesting.
Okay. Everybody else does.
Everybody else does, but I don't. And it was interesting because...
What do you call yourself?
Well, I'm just a human being, I'm Steve, and this is my one way of communicating.
Okay.
Music is another way. I produce some music and stuff. I speak, I write. So, but the interesting thing is a friend of mine who's since passed away once told me, he said, Steve, you are a poet. Don't confuse the form with the essence. And what he was saying is that because I've never studied poetry formally and I don't write formally, that doesn't mean that the essence isn't poetry. Because I think we're all artists, and I think we're all poets. So speaking to that point is, I think we're all poets. It's just that we speak in a different way, or we create in a different way, we express in a different way. On the topic of how do we get people back into poetry, I've thought about it a lot, because people don't like to read, and the new trend, the new culture is little sound bites or little. So what I've done is I've taken some of my poems and I've put them to music. And,
oh, wow.
And some of them, because of my past as a club DJ, some of that is dance tracks. So what I've done is I've taken the poetry and I've produced it into music, and I've also produced videos that go with that, because then I've try to incorporate all three of the things. It's the spoken word, it's the sound, the music, and also the visual element. And that's been my approach of trying to get people to see, because people will watch something but they won't read it.
Yeah, and we're going to wrap up with another poem as we come to the end. But I wanted to just ask you, Wild Divinity is out. Where can people get it? You've got a very active website. But
yes.
Where can people go? How can they interact with you?
Basically on social media, on Facebook or on LinkedIn. But my website is www.stevetsakiris, my name in one word, .com. And from there they can get hold of me and they can get links to everything.
And I just want to spell Tsakiris for you. It's Tsakiris.
That's it.
So Steve Tsakiris on his website, social media platforms. As we wrap up, sir, a final poem from you.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to choose one because there's so many to choose from here. But I'm going to read from Eternal, my other book of poetry.
And will you share with us quickly the idea behind it before you read it?
Behind the poem?
Yeah.
Well, it's called Seeds. And it is what we were talking about. It's about we have the power, as human beings, we have tremendous power to create. And the seeds that we water in our life can be positive or negative. If you, in your garden, water the weeds will grow, the flowers will die. If you don't, if you pluck the weeds and water the seeds of the fruit trees and the flowers, they will grow. So the whole idea is through our thoughts, through our feelings, through our intention, through our actions, we can change our life and we can change the world.
Take it away.
Seeds of heaven, seeds of hell, within me each one lay. Which ones do I feed throughout the course of day? I choose my mindfulness with care, for just a whisper, just a stare, will sprout the seed and grow the flower whose scent shall come to bear. How will my life be shaped by this? How will the flower share? Its knowledge and its wisdom in my life shall come as pair. Come to me, bright young flower, allow your scented beauty to fill aroma, fill my life with love and sense of duty. Compassion, gratitude, concentration can change our state, change our foundation. Our breath, our steps, our mindful pose can blossom, flower like a rose. But if we fail to act, the shadows long can be. The sting of thorns and poison the rose can also free. For generations come and gone, we pass things to each other. The flower and the thorn we give to one another. Our children's children's children are of flower or of thorn. Our mindful practice this very day, our future it will spawn. We don't enlighten for the sake of just our very self. We shift and change, creating flower for those unborn and with no power. Our future can be bleak or bright, depending on how we enlight. We are the soil, we are the water, we are indeed the light, for generations still to come, still far, far out of sight.
919 has signed a code of conduct that